On today's show, the NBA draft is less than 2 weeks away, and there is a smattering of intel around the Hawks when it comes to the draft, when it comes to trade stuff, Quinn Snyder, and everything in between. We'll get into all of it, unpack it all, and more right now.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1994 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Rowland, coming to you deep into the night here on a Wednesday evening into Thursday here in mid-June. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I also want to encourage you at the top of the show, as I always do, to make Locked On Hawks your first listen each and every day. Check us out and subscribe to the show anywhere you find your podcast. That includes Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Be sure to tell your friends about the show and join us all year round. We're busy right now with draft season, free agency, and all that, but this is a 12-month-a-year, 52-week-a-year podcast, so stay tuned, subscribe, and again, tell your friends about the podcast. And it's been heavy draft. It will be from now until the draft, basically. We are less than 2 weeks away from the big day, and we'll get also into some Quinn Snyder random, I would say, rumblings, some news there on Quinn later on in the podcast. But for the most part, there's lots of intel to sift through on this show when it comes to the draft, team building, etc. I wasn't necessarily planning on doing a roundup of the intel, but it's honestly enough to fill the entire episode. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I have more guests lined up later this week, even into next week and beyond about the draft in particular. And I will plug now, as a kind of bridge to the first topic on the podcast, I talked to Rafael Barlow of the Locked On NBA Draft Big Board podcast on Tuesday. Rafael does a great job covering the draft all year round. Is, of course, a colleague of mine at the Locked On Podcast Network. And that show is number one. You should listen to it. But also, if you heard that show, you would have heard it reference something that kind of potentially trading up for the Hawks for Khaman Maluach of Duke, the big 7-footer, lottery pick, all that stuff. That was a topic on that podcast. I would say 10 or 11 hours after we got done recording on Tuesday evening, Rafael then turned some heads more nationally and prominently by writing in his newsletter that the Hawks could be actively exploring ways to move up in the draft for Maluach particularly. Now, there's a big picture part of this about the Hawks and the draft that I'll come back to in a second, but specifically on Maluach, Rafael mentioned and referenced kind of getting up ahead of the Raptors in his writing at his newsletter at 9 if they want to get into the Maluach sweepstakes because the Raptors might take him at 9, for instance. He also heard and referenced that there was interest on the Hawks side that came before the recent front office shakeup. So we'll see on that. And by the way, I covered that in depth earlier this week on the podcast. What I would say is that trading 13 and 22 is not likely to get you any higher than maybe like number 8 or so in the draft, maybe. I did kind of a history study earlier maybe it was even in May, about basically the short version being that 2 picks that are kind of in Atlanta's current range, 13 and 22, do not historically get you that high in the draft, maybe up to like 8-ish, something like that, 8 or 9, generally not into the top 5, top 6. But also on the Maluach front, we didn't have time for the whole back and forth on the show with Rafael because I wanted to get to a lot of different players and topics on that podcast. I think Rafael Smart does a good job covering the draft, but he was much more definitive about the desire for a 7-footer with the Hawks than I actually am with Atlanta, and particularly so in drafting one. That's fine. Of course, we could disagree to some degree. I'm also not a huge proponent of trading up in the class, which I did say to him on the show yesterday, and I would not be trying to run out and really throw all my chips in to trade up for really anyone in this draft, much less Maluach in particular. At the same time, I do totally understand the appeal of Khaman Maluach for the Hawks. And if you're going to trade up, he does make some sense through that lens for the Hawks. I see how you get there for sure. That is particularly the case. If you think that Maluach is like a tier above the guys that are available to you, then that starts to make sense. Like what you need to have for me to do a trade up broadly is like you have to think that there's a guy that you think is like significantly better than your options will be at 13. And then also believe in the fit and all of those things. And it's easy to get there with Maluach, I would say. As we discussed in the chat with Rafael, even I do think Maluach's camp and his agents, representatives, et cetera, should be interested in getting him to Atlanta if possible. Now, it doesn't mean you move heaven and earth, but the Hawks have a core that he would make a lot of sense with, especially with Trae as a lead guard to make him look better on offense. Jalen Johnson as someone helping with his deficiencies on the glass, for instance. Jalen is a grab-and-go guy, all that stuff. And also, quickly, this we'll save more of this for later if we need to talk about it more. There's a world, I think, where you can actually play Okongwu and Maluach some together, particularly because Maluach has the potential, I would say, to shoot it. Not everyone believes that he will, but he might be able to do that. Plus, Okongwu's shooting development, the fact that he's more of a a little bit more versatile, and Maluach is the rim protector. Like, I'm not saying that's the primary reason why you would do it, but certainly there is room for an investment at center. Even if you are a believer in Okongwu like I am, the Hawks could still add another center. And I've been saying this for months and months and months now, maybe even years now. Unless you have a star center, you need two that are like good players, because most guys don't play more than 28 minutes a game unless they're absolute stars of the position. So all that said, I get it. I would not be all in on that, but I totally understand the thought process. Anyway, that's the Maluach part of this. Back to the big picture piece about the Hawks in the draft. Barlow has them exploring trade-up scenarios in that piece and on the podcast, and then maybe hours later, I would say on Wednesday, there was some directly opposing intel that came in from Jake Fisher, who wrote on Mark Stein's Substack in his newsletter that the Hawks have, quote, generated little chatter about the prospect of packaging those two selections, end quote. Jake also wrote that it is a common suggestion for teams like Oklahoma City, Orlando, and Brooklyn to have multiple picks to trade up in this class, but not so much for Atlanta. Now, that does not mean that one is right and one is wrong. Keep that in mind. This is like we're officially entering smokescreen silly season now in the NBA draft. We're under 2 weeks left. This is going to happen. Not just because of the Hawks. You will see conflicting information making the rounds. That's just what happens this time of year. So the Hawks could do this. They could trade up. They may not trade up. But it does speak to the kind of uncertainty out there that I'm talking about a lot in recent days. And I won't do it again in full, but the Hawks front office is now a first-time group together that we don't know that much about. Also, we know the key stakeholders. I know, honestly, the guys that they just brought in from New Orleans and Philadelphia, respectively, are respected people. I know Kyle Korver. I know Tony Wrestler to some degree. Like, I get it, but this is a group that does not have a track record together, and that adds to uncertainty. Also, some of the guys just got there this week, and that means even more uncertainty. Tony Wrestler, as a owner who is active, adds uncertainty to the process. All that said, as someone covering the team, I do wish I knew more right now and was more confident in more, but there's also an argument that public uncertainty, if you are a fan, is actually a good thing, because the Hawks would then have options and not like tip their hand. There's some advantage to being the kind of no leaks team. I mean, you go back 10 years and the Hawks were kind of renowned under Danny Ferry 10 plus years ago for never leaking anything. And it was like a badge of honor that they wore to themselves. You don't have to do that either. That's kind of where you are. So on the front office front, there was some more general reporting from Fisher in that same piece at Mark Stein's Substack. He wrote about the sentiment that I shared earlier this week on the podcast, in that the way he phrased it is that, quote, it seems more likely that Graham and Dinwiddie, who are the two guys that Hawks just hired, could result in the most significant front office additions to Atlanta this offseason, end quote. So that's what I shared this week as well. Jake backs that up. He noted that the Hawks have a pretty big front office already, which is true. And also, even if he did kind of acknowledge that the senior advisor path has kind of been out there in the ether, I referenced that with Danny Ferry a couple weeks ago on the show, that wouldn't be someone hired above Anssi. That would be somebody else that's another voice in the room. So I'll reiterate this one more time. I said it briefly and probably in more depth earlier this week, but I will be surprised now if the Hawks hire anyone above Anssi Saleh on the org chart. So there's that. That's where I'll leave it for now. But if you want more on that, I discussed that on the Emergency Podcast earlier this week. On the roster side, Fisher framed it as a, quote, greater league-wide curiosity, end quote, about Atlanta's plans, which I agree and confirm. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty and curiosity about what are the Hawks doing, generally speaking. No one seems to know. Like, I heard a podcast today from my friend Sam Vecini and also Bryce on the Game Theory podcast. Those guys did a great job always, but that was a good, responsible national offseason breakdown of the Hawks. I didn't agree with all of it, but it was a good podcast. And they're kind of like, hey, could be straight ahead. And I agree. Like, I've laid out, there's a very straight ahead offseason for the Hawks. If they want to just retain all their guys, use the mid-level, bring Karis LeVert back, make 2 draft picks, that's a pretty ho-hum, reasonable offseason. They could also get a little bit more aggressive in any direction. So there's just a lot of uncertainty there. Speaking of Karis LeVert, nothing new here, but Fisher wrote about the sources that he has saying that, quote, Atlanta has shown a keen interest, end quote, in bringing Karis LeVert back. Lauren Williams reported this week, or maybe last week, that resigning LeVert is a priority for the Hawks. That makes total sense. I've said that for a while now. I think pretty much everyone that I have talked to around the league and around the Hawks is like kind of agreement there. Not that it's done or that it's anything close to that, but I think a lot of people, including me, think that like LeVert is likely, or at least pretty likely, to be back in Atlanta. That can all change though. If he gets an offer that you're not seeing coming, and I include myself in that, for more money, that can change quickly because guys need to take the most money they can get most of the time. But I think right now, my projection is that Karras is pretty likely to return, and that was another kind of arrow in that quiver from Jake Fisher. All right, more to come in a moment about all kinds of reporting that's out there from Jake and other people when it comes to trade exceptions that they might be able to use. There's some Myles Turner stuff. There's Quin Snyder stuff. There's Trae Young stuff. We'll get into all that and more in just one moment. So this is brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like the NBA playoffs. The intensity, the buzzer beaters, and the fans losing their minds is kind of the atmosphere that you actually have to experience live. And if you want in, Game Time makes it fast and easy to get seats even for the biggest possible playoff games. Prices on the Game Time actually drop closer to tip-off, and with killer last-minute deals and no surprise fees, Game Time is a total game changer for you. I love that I actually see the exact view from my seats before I buy them with no surprises. And the NFL schedule is also out right now. And you better believe I'm already looking at my stuff for the fall when it comes to calendars and travel, picking which games to hit. Game Time also makes scoring tickets for the NFL just as easy as the NBA and other sports as well. And with the Game Time guarantee, you have tickets that are 100% authentic. They will arrive for you on time, and you'll always get the best possible price with fees included. So what you see is what you pay at Game Time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets right now with the folks at the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account with Game Time and use that code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, and going back to that Jake Fisher reported piece on Mark Stein's Substack on Wednesday, he referenced the DeJounte Murray trade exception that I talked about quite a few times and the possibility of using it this summer. Now, so did Sam Vecini, by the way, on that podcast that I referenced earlier on Game Theory. That's not a secret. It's out there. People know that they have it. They might use it. I have often also said that it's not likely to be used. Exceptions like that expire all the time without being used. It's nothing crazy if they don't use it, but it's another arrow and the kind of just ability to have optionality, basically, like just versatility, roster building mechanisms. They have different ways to add to the roster. Now, the big reason I'm bringing that up now is that Fisher brought up Myles Turner. So Myles Turner, who just played in a finals game as I'm recording this podcast. And by the way, the Pacers up 2-1. That surprises me, but the Pacers are playing great. They defended crazy well in Game 3. This is not a Pacers or a Thunder podcast, but I was wrong about the series in general. I still think Oklahoma City probably wins it, but man, the Pacers look really good. They're playing great, and Turner was a big factor in the fourth quarter tonight after a kind of early struggle. Anyway, Fisher brought up Myles Turner in conjunction with the Hawks. So it was also with some cold water. Jake wrote that before the run Indiana is on, the Hawks were thinking of Turner as a potential sign-and-trade target using the Murray exception potentially. So basically, what I've said before, like in previous free agency previews, about how the only way to get Myles Turner in Atlanta probably is to do a sign-and-trade. No surprise there. That's something I've said many times. Now, it wasn't a crazy thought a few weeks ago, I would say. There was some buzz he could get away from Indiana. But given that Indiana is now in the finals, and now I'm updating this, leading the finals 2-1, with no real way to replace him, Jake wrote even earlier today that the assumption that is out there, what I have heard too, is that Turner is likely to stay in Indiana, which just makes a lot of sense. Like they're a good team. They're in the finals. They might win the championship. He's their guy at center. And Jake wrote that Turner is, quote, likely to come to terms on a new deal that pays him at least $30 million in average annual value, end quote, with the Pacers. So without going crazy deep into this, there was a report earlier this week from Grant Absith, I believe it was on RG.com, about Turner. People asked me about. I don't think it was like worth a deep dive on the podcast, but it basically just said the Hawks could be interested in Myles Turner. So yeah, I'm sure they could have been interested. They probably are interested to some degree. I was going to lay out, if I needed to, how unlikely that was financially, because Jake kind of did it for me a little bit on his reporting today. But the Hawks, to say this plainly, do not have cap space to offer Myles Turner a huge deal. It's the mid-level or nothing on cap space. So it has to be a sign and trade. They can happen, but they're hard to negotiate, and they require three-way cooperation between one team, another team, and the player agent. The Pacers in the finals, they need Turner. I'm not saying it's a 0% chance, but I would say it's unlikely, to be sure, that the Hawks will get Myles Turner. Also, there's a whole different discussion that I will have if I need to have it about whether that's even a good idea. Turner's a good player, to be sure, but he definitely has strong flaws. Like, he does have the skills that everybody wants of three-point shooting and shot blocking. There's also a really bad rebounder, inside the arc scoring. Like, he's not a perfect player. He's a good player for sure, but he's almost 30 and, all those things. So anyway, I understand the interest because that archetype of shooting and rim protection is very valuable, but I'll get back to this if we need to. But in the meantime, it seems like the cold water is out there, and I would agree with the cold water because of all the factors in play. The difficulty of doing sign and trades and the fact that the Pacers are, again, leading the finals after 3 games. One more thing here before we get to a Trae Young rumbling later in the podcast. This kind of came out of nowhere-ish today. The New York Knicks, who are still looking for a head coach, apparently requested permission to talk to Quinn Snyder about their opening. Now, that might seem shocking. It's less shocking when you realize that the Knicks have now talked to, reportedly, teams about Chris Finch in Minnesota, Ime Udoka in Houston, Jason Kidd in Dallas, and I believe I even saw Billy Donovan's name today in Chicago. So Quinn's not alone in this, but a lot of established coaches who are safe in their jobs, it seems like, are the guys that Knicks are trying to at least talk about. Shams also reported immediately that the Knicks were, quote, firmly denied, end quote, by the Hawks. Trae Young replied on Twitter with quote, hell no, end quote, and some crying emojis. So that was funny. Trae's had Quinn's back quite a bit. It seems like all's hunky-dory there, as I've said many times. So nothing huge here. There's no takeaway other than this is what happened. Now, I guess 2 observations on this. Number one is that I was getting asked a lot 2 months ago if Quinn was in trouble after the season. And I basically said that he was nowhere near fired from what I was understanding. I said the day that the Hawks actually fired Landry Fields that keeping Quinn was actually an endorsement of Quinn that day, because normally if you're going to fire the GM, you might consider firing the coach. I thought that spoke volumes that they did not do that. And even stronger about that right now. I think he's not anywhere close to being fired. There's evidence there. I think he's quite safe. And even as they were talking to front office candidates, I heard through the grapevine that they were telling front office people that Quinn was going to be the coach. There were basically 2, not stipulations, but plainly presented things. Hey, president of basketball operations candidate, you're going to have a GM in Ansi Saleh, and your coach is Quinn Snyder. And you could certainly say that's not the greatest way to do a president search, which I would actually kind of agree with, even though I like Quinn and I like Ansi. You're not going to get the same level of candidate if you're making stipulations like that. But it does say that Tony Ressler, it seems like, is committed to Ansi and he's committed to Quinn. And that's another reminder here of just why they said no. The second thing is that I know that not every Hawks fan loves Quinn Snyder. I know the win-loss records have been incredible in Atlanta, but he has very clear respect around the league as a high-level coach. Now, I'm not saying he's Eric Spoelstra. I'm not saying he's a top 5 coach in the league. I would not say that, actually. I think that Quinn is a good coach. I don't think Quinn's an elite coach. There are guys I'd rather have in a vacuum. I think he's good at his job. I think he's smart. I know the Hawks, again, Hawks fans not always in love with him, but I think he's above average solidly. And making the rounds today, making calls about this topic when it came out, people around the league, people that work with agencies or work with other teams, or anyway, the consensus was that people still think Quinn is good. You don't have to agree with that, but the general league feel is that Quinn is good, and it was not a surprise to everyone that he was at least being called when it came to the Knicks and having some interest. But hey, he's still the Hawks head coach and isn't going anywhere, it seems. All right, one more rumory thing in a second, and it comes actually about Trae Young and the Sacramento Kings, of all teams. We'll get to that and more in just one moment. Today's show is brought to you by WayFair. There's nothing like stepping into your own outdoor space and feeling like you've escaped into a personal oasis. If you want to update your patio this season, WayFair has made it so easy, turning that space into a feeling of your own. Comfortable, stylish, and ready for summer, WayFair has everything you need to level up your outdoor space. That includes conversation sets and outdoor bars, fire pits, hot tub, gazebos, and everything in between, even the perfect string lights to see the vine and the life that you want whenever you want to have it in your backyard. It's like giving your backyard the resort feel without actually having the resort price tag. That's obviously great. If you're working with a budget like I am all the time, you also filter and find exactly what you need with WayFair. And that's also the case if you don't have a massive space as well and want to work within a smaller area of land. And delivery with WayFair is also free, fast, and totally hassle-free, even for larger items. That's been huge for me in the past and will always be in the future. And that, for me, and now whether it's an event that I'm hosting with friends or just unwinding in a small group by myself, it generally feels like a personal and private retreat if you want to have that set up with WayFair. Don't wait. Make outdoor space your dream oasis today with WayFair and enjoy it all summer long. Head to wayfair.com right now to shop a huge outdoor selection. That is WAYFAIR, wayfair.com. WayFair, every style, every home. All right, I teed it up. It's one more kind of rumor adjacent thing. It's been asked about quite a bit in the last day or two as the reporting came out. And I feel like I have to answer it a little bit on the show. So Grant Asset, who I referenced before on the podcast about the Myles Turner thing from, I believe it's RG.com now. I think he's Dallas-based reporter. I don't know Grant, just throwing it out there. Not like he's not Shams, but someone who follows the league. Had something in a recent post about the Kings and the Hawks talking about Trae Young and a framework of a deal. And by deal, I mean a trade to send Trae to Sacramento. He did also say in that same piece that the talks have cooled from what he had heard. So even the report is not saying that there's anything happening now between the Hawks and the Kings. But it made its way to like Hoops Hype. It was kind of out there. And people were asking me if this was real or not, basically. What to make of this report. Earlier this summer, Jake Fisher said, I said, like, the signs were pointing to Trae sticking around Atlanta. I still have heard that for the most part. There is the other domino of the extension, which I've talked about ad nauseum already this summer and will happen, I'm sure, a lot more later on in the summer. But we all know the deal here. If you don't, the short version is Trae is extension eligible starting in about 2.5-3 weeks. And there's the domino of like extension negotiations there, whether they're going to keep him. Basically, there's three options. There is keep him with an extension, keep him with no extension, or trade. Those are the three options. I think the most likely outcome is keep and extend, followed by keep and not extend, and then trade. But we will see. Things can change. I have not, to put it this way, I have not heard about like active two-way, super engaged talks between the Kings and the Hawks at this point. That does not mean they haven't happened. Like I said before, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and it's something that people don't necessarily realize. And I learned more as I cover the league for longer. It's been a long time now. There are generally way more quote unquote talks between teams than people actually realize. What I mean by that is the vast majority of them are not reported and they don't rise to be like particularly notable. It might be one call or it's like, hey, what's your asking price? It could be something like that. It could be like, you call on a player and it's like, is there any chances available? No, hang up the phone. That kind of thing happens all the time and does not regularly get reported. It could be one call. It could be 4 calls. We don't know. It could be one-sided. The Kings might really like Trae Young. If I was the Kings, I would really be calling about Trae Young. The Kings are kind of rudderless in some ways. Like, I know they're kind of in the same area as the Hawks in the win-loss department, but the Hawks have a young core that makes sense together, and the Kings, frankly, do not. And that is the difference there. So if I'm the Kings and Trae Young is available, which I don't even know if he is, but I would call. No beef there. On the other side of things, I don't really see, this is me now. I'm not the GM. I don't personally see a lot of fruitful trade options between the Hawks and the Kings that I would be enticed by. Granted, I'm higher on Trae than some. Maybe there's a 3-team deal available or whatever. I would not be trying to trade Trae. I've said that before. I say that again now. But part of this is like the Kings only have a ton of appealing assets. They have draft picks. Trae makes a lot of money too. Like you have to match salary in the NBA. That's one of the dominoes of NBA trades. So they have 2 very expensive players on their roster in Domantas Sabonis and Zach LaVine. I would assume it's not a Sabonis for Trae swap. Maybe I'm wrong about that in whatever hierarchy this would be. But put that to the side. I would not want LaVine, especially without Trae. Like it's kind of an odd fit. I'm not saying LaVine's bad. He's a good player. It's a big contract for 2 more years. I don't necessarily love that deal as a centerpiece. Maybe a LaVine and like every pick the Kings have swap for Trae. If the Hawks were ready to trade Trae, that's not insane, but I don't think that's a good idea for me. Sabonis is obviously good, but that's different. Then you have DeMar DeRozan and Malik Monk, who make like half of what Trae makes each. I wouldn't want DeRozan necessarily on that deal. It's not bad for what he does. He's an interesting player, kind of flawed, but also skilled still at this point in time. Monk is a good player on a good contract, but he's not like a headliner for me on a Trae Young trade. That's kind of where I put that. So if you made me do a trade with the Kings for Trae, if you said you have to, Brad Rowland, choose a deal with the Kings for Trae Young, it would be a combination of Malik Monk, Keegan Murray, and whatever filler salary, and then picks and assets. That's what I want to get if I was the Hawks. If you made me do a trade, I want Monk to be a shot creator for you. Probably, ideally a third guard in my opinion, but like an awesome third guard, like an elite third guard. Could be a starter, good player, good contract. And Murray is not taking a huge step forward, but he's a good player. Like can defend, can shoot it, all those things. Maybe you get Devin Carter in the deal, draft picks. That's not enough money, by the way, just those two guys for Trae. So I'm going to stop here and not do the rabbit hole of this because I don't think it's that serious at this moment in time. Maybe it would be at some point. Maybe at some point it gets serious. In fact, on that podcast I referenced once before, so last time I'll do this today, Sam Vecini and Bryce Simon talked about Trae trades, and they went through the whole league quickly of like what teams would even make sense. And they kind of didn't even talk about the Kings. It was like they breezed by. But it's a good exercise. Like one reason I have said on the show, and I'll say it again right now, that I don't think Trae has. I'll take the more affirmative point. I think Trae is worth more to the Hawks than he is in a trade, which I've said many times. Part of that is that Trae's awesome. The other part of that maybe is that I don't think there's a huge market for him. If you go like team to team to team, there are teams that would like to have Trae or should like to have Trae. The Kings are one of those teams, but there aren't that many of them. So all that said, interesting situation, I guess. I'm going to do the short answer now and stop. But for now, just to put a button in this right now, just to answer the questions that I've been getting, and I got probably literally 20 questions, if not more than that, about this. I am quite skeptical that I would like a trade of Trae to the Kings if that was to happen. I'm not the GM, but I've also not heard that there are like super interesting trade negotiations happening there. Could they have made calls? Sure. I think that Hawks did talk to teams about Trae Young last summer. Now, nothing got close. They ended up trading DeJounte. That was the right move. I said as much at the time. Worked out great. But it's not like they are hanging up the phone on everyone who calls about Trae for the last year and a half. They used to do that 4 years ago. Now, you pick up the phone. I don't love that, but I get why they're doing it. It's a different situation now. But the short version is I don't know of anything active close with the Kings or any team. My projection still as of June 11th into June 12th is Trae's on the team into next year. But that's the little reporting that was out there and my interpretation of it. All right, everybody. That's all I have on a relatively brisk episode on a Wednesday evening into Thursday. I will have at least one more show this week, hopefully sometime on Friday. I have a guest planned, but you never want to commit to that unless it's done, so I don't want to announce that. But I will have a show at some point on Friday, if nothing else, and then into next week and beyond. So stay tuned for that. Please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you find podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Also, please tell your friends, follow the show on X/Twitter at Locked On Hawks. You can follow me there at BT Rowland and follow me on Blue Sky at BT Rowland. And also my written work on the Hawks in non-podcast fashion is at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I appreciate everybody listening to the podcast today. As always, enjoy your Thursday, and we'll see you all next time.